All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's 7 lecture. Today is the second lecture in our exploration of how journalism, both individual journalists and media organizations, responded to the new challenge of social media as it emerged from the mid-2000s onwards. We've talked last week about the response by individual journalists, how they started to grudgingly and slowly perhaps, but still come to terms with the use of social media in their everyday practices. So today it's the turn of the news industry and its varying responses to social media as well. So let's get started and have a look at how journalism industry players started to respond to social media. As I say, last week, the very sort of reluctant, the very gradual and very grudging kind of adoption of social media by individual journalists, except for some of the trailblazers, of course, who jumped in reasonably quickly and became the leaders in this change. This week, the growing use of social media and particularly also of social media metrics by news organizations. And then next week, we'll look at the particular form of live blogging as a kind of a really interesting attempt to connect traditional journalistic practices and new social media practices. Live blogging is kind of where social media and journalism really meet and blend together as well. So that's something we'll look at next week. But first, of course, as the news industry saw more journalists actually engaging with social media, setting up their social media accounts, being active, becoming known, becoming visible on social media as well. One of the maybe natural responses, certainly one of the typical responses, is, of course, to try to set standards, to try and channel that kind of activity into acceptable standards. And that's really what happened here first. So as journalists of various news organizations started to join social media, those news organizations began to develop social media guidelines that were trying to govern this kind of use of social media, that would apply to the use of personal accounts by journalists and how they should present themselves on social media, to what extent they should be presenting their personal individual views that may differ from the views of the news outlet, or use professional language and present themselves still as professional journalists and nothing else. How they should engage, to what extent they should engage with their sources, with their colleagues, both in their own organization and in other news outlets, and of course their audiences as well, most importantly perhaps. What they should do with breaking news. Should they just talk about that on social media, or should they wait until there's a story on their own news site that they could promote and thereby draw an audience to that site? Because, of course, just talking about it on social media is not to the benefit, ultimately, from a commercial point of view of the news organization itself. To what extent they should acknowledge their competitors and even promote their stories, acknowledge their stories when they are about an important and interesting topic. And so, for instance, at Sky News in the UK, journalists, according to their official guidelines, were not allowed to retweet any message originating from someone who is not affiliated with the outlet, not from other journalists, not from other organizations of any kind, not from politicians, government, institutions, whatever else it might be. That's a very restrictive approach, obviously. So if you were following a journalist, all you would see in terms of retweets would be messages from their organization. So then a BBC journalist retweeting a BBC news account, or in this case, a Sky News UK journalist retweeting the Sky News UK news account, or perhaps the accounts of their colleagues. That's very restrictive and, of course, might make that account of the journalist less interesting to follow, because all you see is just more stuff from the same news organization. And of course, journalists themselves, individual journalists, responded to that and said, well, I'd find that unfortunate because really I use Twitter, and the same might be said about other social media platforms, personally, not just professionally. And I use it to vent my thoughts, to say things that perhaps I couldn't do in my professional life. So part of the question here is also, how much right does the news organization as the employer have to tell individual journalists what they can and can't do on their personal, on their private social media account, which of course isn't quite just personal because they are there and they're known as a journalist for that news organization. So it's a very confusing kind of point where it's not clear, are they there in their own capacity as a just an ordinary person, or are they there as a representative of the news outlet, or both? And in which case, well, how do you deal with that? So these are some of the challenges that they're trying to address. To some extent, also beyond that, as these individual journalists and their social media accounts become better known, more visible, more prominent, perhaps gain a large audience, of course, that's a form of personal branding. That's a way of turning themselves into a news brand that might be independent of the news organization. So they're appearing as themselves, and you might be able to think of prominent Swiss or German or UK or US journalists that you know of who have become very prominent for themselves, in and of themselves, rather than as an employee of a particular news organization. So how do you manage that? Again, how do you deal with that? Because, of course, that may not be necessarily to the benefit of the news brand itself. It certainly makes that journalist very influential, and they become really influencers in the proper sense of the term. But it might also direct attention away from the company, from the news brand that they actually work for. And again, as Kate Day there says from the Telegraph in the UK, well, that's great for them, wonderful for them to create a news brand for themselves. But there are, of course, some editors who struggle to understand how that's actually great for the Telegraph, for the news outlet that they're working for, because it might not gain further recognition just because it's got some influencer journalist working for it. And of course, that journalist might at some point move somewhere else, take all of their followers with them, and start working for the BBC or some other outlet. So it's not necessarily beneficial to the Telegraph to have this influencer journalist working for it and being an influencer on social media. Of course, being an influencer, being highly visible, also comes with all of the negative consequences that unfortunately now apply to that kind of status. So journalists who are becoming known in and of themselves might also attract various forms of unwanted attention, might attract personal attacks, might be stalked by followers because they love them, hate them, whatever else in between, and might have to fear for their personal safety even. And that applies, as we now know, having had these kinds of influencer journalists now around for the best part of a decade or so, that applies, unfortunately, particularly to women journalists, to journalists from minority backgrounds, and of course to journalists who, for one reason or another, are seen to be controversial in some way. And that's, again, problematic and also has repercussions not just for that journalist themselves, but also for the news organization for whom they work. And so we get more and more to a point where news organizations are creating detailed guidelines on how to behave on social media, what to do and what not to do on social media. And here are some examples that I've taken from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the major public broadcaster in Australia. So it sets, to begin with, personal social media standards. It says for all ABC workers, so that's not just the journalists, but anyone else who works for the ABC as well, you must use social media, even if it's personal, even if it's for personal purposes, in the following ways. Don't damage our reputation, the ABC's reputation for impartiality and independence. Don't undermine your effectiveness at work. So don't put yourself in a position where you might be able to be attacked because you're seen as highly ideological or whatever else. Don't mix the professional and the personal in a way that is likely to bring the ABC into disrepute. Don't talk about your own personal affairs in a way that might reflect badly on the ABC. Don't imply ABC endorsement for your personal views, of your personal views. So make clear that if you're on social media as yourself, you're talking for yourself, you're not talking for the organization. Don't disclose confidential information obtained through work. Most of these are perhaps fairly straightforward and fairly acceptable. And of course, the ABC's arrived at them through a long process of negotiation, discussion, argument, disagreement as well. And then it says, well, here are some examples that might be problematic, that are likely to breach these standards. A political reporter expressing a strong personal opinion on a political issue. A local reporter tweeting something derogatory about the local mayor. A worker in the people and culture area sharing confidential information about forthcoming redundancies. So internal business, not just even news necessarily. A news presenter revealing publicly how they're going to vote or expressing support for a political party. A procurement officer, so someone who's buying stuff, involved in a telecommunications tender, publicly criticizing a telco over a shoddy home line. So mixing the personal and the professional in a way that might generate the impression of a conflict of interest. An executive revealing confidential matters discussed at a strategy meeting. A website developer saying the ABC endorses a particular product. Some of these, as you're seeing, they are no longer really just about journalists, but about others as well. But again, a radio presenter promoting a commercial product as part of a sponsored post arrangement or in exchange for receiving it for free. A children's presenter using very coarse language or posting lewd material. And a worker using social media to abuse or vilify other workers. So within the own organization as well, having conflict carried out via social media. And then, in fact, they identify what they say are high-risk workers, people with a very particularly high profile, the presenters of the nightly evening news, the senior executives and others who are clearly in the public eye much more than some new cadet reporter. So the higher your profile, the more senior your role, the greater the reputational damage to you and the ABC if you breach the standards, and the more likely a breach will draw notice. And notice they're really from other journalists, other news organizations, from politics, from the government, which ultimately funds the ABC. Personal content should be treated with the same care as if being published on an ABC platform. So if they're posting about themselves, in some way, about their family, about where they're going on holidays, maybe that's not such a good idea because they're very high profile and that could lead to stalking or other kinds of negative repercussions. Consider a regular review or automated removal of your historical posts on public-facing social media. What may have been appropriate to say a decade ago could be seen in a different light now. So this is now the problem of having been on social media for a long time and maybe changing your views. And then, of course, some competitor, some politician, someone else could eventually point to those views and say, aha, you are a radical, or you've changed your mind, who can even trust you anymore? Engage in debate generally in a respectful manner, avoiding abusive language. Well, that probably shouldn't just apply to high-risk workers, but particularly to them, of course. Avoid anything that could be construed as personal disapproval or personal support for policies and actions or inactions of public figures. So don't really get involved too deeply in public debates yourself. And avoid engaging in advocacy on matters of contention. So again, many of these are understandable from the point of view of the organization and are genuinely, I think, also designed to try to protect these high-risk workers from any kind of negative repercussions that might come from the government, from politicians, from others who could use these kinds of actions to attack them. But, of course, it also very strongly curtails, limits what they're able to do still on social media. And from that perspective, it could be seen, of course, as interfering with their rights to free speech and freedom of expression. But that's quite a common example. These kinds of guidelines are very common examples of the sort of advice that and the sort of standards that many news organizations now set for their social media using staff, particularly for their journalists. The other side of what happens, and what I'll spend a bit more time on, I think, today in the discussion. So the other part of what news organizations started to do as social media were becoming more important to their business model, to their activities, and simply as sources of information about how stories were being received, were being used, were being read, were being viewed, were being shared and engaged with, and so on, was to develop social media metrics capabilities to quantify all of these kinds of aspects, how well stories are doing, via gathering metrics directly from social media platforms, gathering data directly from social media platforms. And this takes various forms. There's a broad range of products out there as well in the business now that are being used. Here's one example, just one example of what that might look like. So for instance, here you see just, and this is obviously some years old now as a screenshot, but you see there the major stories at the time on a number of different news outlets. You see there maybe the BBC, you see there the New York Times stories, you see their graphs on how these have performed on Facebook on the right there, particularly, and this could be done for other platforms as well. So how much they've been probably engaged with or shared or commented upon as well. And in fact, you see there a range of tabs at the top there as well that say stories, syndication, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, Twitter, influencers, creators, watch list. So it looks broadly at these 4 platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, and Twitter. The authors of this particular dashboard also seem to have created a list of influencers, and those may be journalists and others, they may be politicians, they may be celebrities, stars of various forms, or genuine social media influencers as well. And they seem to have been selected specifically to see to what extent a story has been picked up by these particular influencers, how much they've engaged with this material and shared it on. Creators, which is perhaps a different category of influencer, and then a watch list, and that might be perhaps particular politicians or others who might be likely to engage with this sort of material, perhaps also trolls and others who are often highly critical and who may require a response in order to protect the reputation of the organization. So this is quite a typical sort of dashboard that is now common in many news outlets and many news organizations to monitor how well both their own stories are going. And you see, of course, this covers a bunch of outlets. So to monitor both how well their own stories are going, as well as how their competitors are doing. So what the key and major successful stories are for their competitors, to see why these stories and not the news organization's own stories about these matters are trending, are being shared, are being engaged with, and what can be done to change that. So that's what these sort of dashboards look like. Here's another example there, and I'm going to draw quite a bit on this report by Federica Cherubini and Rasmus Klaus-Nielsen on editorial analytics from 2016, it has to be said. So things will have moved on a little bit further still since then. And that's important to just keep in mind as well. This is not necessarily the latest part of the story, but this is one of the best and most comprehensive updates that we've had in recent times on how this is actually working. So here we see on the right of your screen, and again, you can download the slides and perhaps have a closer look if some of this isn't so readable in this webcast. But you see there just data on a single story from The Guardian, from The Guardian's dashboard called OFAN, which is, again, a similar sort of product to what I've just shown you. So you can see here, again, how this story has done over time. You can see in the graph at the top how it's been shared or been accessed from different platforms. I see the Guardian website itself, Google, Facebook, unknown sources that might be sharing it, Twitter, Reddit, and Guardian emails and others. So you can see that some unknown source obviously started to share this story at some point, and that's when the graph really took off. That's that red part of the graph that suddenly started to take off. It then breaks it down into where it's being read in the UK, the US, Australia, the EU, other than the UK, and the rest of the world. And largely this is obviously finds an audience in the UK. What devices it's being read from desktop browsers, from phone browsers, from tablet browsers, or from the Guardian app, and how people found it. And again, that's basically another version of the graph at the top, the Guardian, Google, Facebook, some unknown source, which seems to have been quite important in this case, Twitter, Reddit, Guardian emails, and others. So for each of these individual stories, this can be produced, and of course it can be aggregated also at a higher level to see how the content is doing each day, and what areas of content, what news beats, whether it's politics or society or sports or the weather or whatever else, is getting a lot of attention. And by the way, too, you see there at the top of this graph as well, this particular story had nearly 160,000 page views on the Guardian site. And on average, and this is also important, people spend 3 minutes with that story. And that's actually fairly significant. Many engagement sessions with news content are a lot shorter. So this is quite a successful story from that perspective. Here's another example. This is Chartbeat, which is another fairly well-known tool that's being offered to news outlets. And this is for the kind of news and technology site Gizmodo from 2016 again too. And you see there, for instance, there within Gizmodo, what are the top pages that are being accessed? It's front page Gizmodo, we come from the future, and then the individual stories that are especially successful. You see again what traffic sources, internal links, social, direct, or search, what referrers, email, Facebook, Kotaku, Deadspin, Google, Gizmodo itself, Gawker, Facebook, Feedly, and Jalopnik people were coming from. So who's really linking to these stories? You see on the other side there also whether these are new or returning or particularly loyal visitors. So that's interesting to break down your audience into people who are actually new to the site, who are not visiting normally, or who are repeat visitors. Again, whether they're coming from desktop, mobile or tablet, and what locations, the US, Canada, the UK, and Germany in this particular case. And there is also a recirculation rate that's being calculated there. There's a second sidebar, you see 7% recirculation. So that is how many people come in from one of these sources to see, to access a particular story, but then also keep moving along on that site, keep moving to other pieces of content on that site. Really who are reading more than one story ultimately on that page, on that website as well. And it's only 7%, but again, that's not unusual because so much more these days, people are simply accessing individual news stories rather than continuing to browse an entire website for its content. And here, by the way, we see that the average engage time across the site is only 48 seconds. So the 3 minutes that we just saw with the Guardian story were actually a lot more for that particular story than perhaps the average even on the Guardian would be as well. So there we see, again, this is the sort of the typical dashboards. I've shown you a few different versions of this, but in many ways they provide very, very similar kind of data, very similar metrics on engagement with these stories. And that's, of course, the question. Well, which of these metrics are in fact important? Which metrics should we look at? Which metrics should we follow to tell us how a website is in fact doing? And this is very much an open question, a question that is continuously debated. And the metrics themselves, of course, continue to change as well because platforms keep changing, the way that people engage with platforms keep changing. So the metrics are constantly updated in various ways and for different platforms as well. The problem here is also that the metrics are, not all metrics are equally well defined in comparison to each other. This is again a graph from the Cherubini and Nielsen report that distinguishes on the left side relatively clear definitions and measurements that can be generated, and towards the right far less clear definitions and measurements. And then it also looks at definition, measurement, and data issues. So it says, for instance, the reach of a particular piece of content is relatively easy to measure. The number of people exposed to a content in a given period of time. On the website, you can just see, well, how many visitors has this piece of content actually had? You can define that relatively easily. And you can say, well, unique users on the website, unique user sessions in apps, in the app that the news outlet might have created as well. Unique impressions, perhaps via social media. It gets a little bit more tricky there already, just because someone might have had the headline for a story in their news feed doesn't mean that they've actually looked at that headline. So maybe that isn't quite reach anymore. And of course, then there are some issues there already. Access to offsite data from other platforms, the use of apps or browser tools, and in fact, if people are accessing the same story multiple times via different pathways on a website, on maybe via their mobile device, via their desktop device, is that actually multiple accesses? Should that be counted as multiple points of reach, or is that just still the one user, of course, accessing it? And that cannot be easily deduplicated, as they're saying there. And then as they go on, of course, they say, well, engagement is already a little bit more difficult to measure. You could measure the time that people spend on the website, the time that they spend on an app. But of course, I might just put my phone down and make a coffee, and all the time the app's still open. So that's not really engagement either. So engage time that's actively interacting with content might be a better measure, and that's, again, more difficult to capture. And of course, perhaps also how many pages per visit they actually engage with. Are they just going to the individual story and then going away again, or are they continuing to recirculate, as we've seen across the website as well? And again, that just integrating that across across the same user on multiple devices might be very difficult. And of course, particularly for more legacy media that also still have print and broadcast versions, you really don't want to just look at the website, but you'd love to see that kind of engagement data for these other versions as well. And that's a lot more difficult to capture. So the particular component that is web engagement might be where the metrics are, but that's not all the engagement, of course, that exists. And then there are some much more vaguely defined kind of measures like loyalty. How loyal are you to a brand? How would you measure that? Return visits, yes. Return user sessions on an app, yes, sure. But is that kind of just random because every once in a while you see a New York Times story appearing in your feed, and every once in a while you click on it? That doesn't mean that you're necessarily loyal to the website or loyal to the New York Times. It might just be that it appears reasonably often in your feed. It might actually be the loyalty of the people who are sharing this with you that's important here, not so much your own loyalty. So measuring this is actually quite complicated, and defining even what loyalty really means for a news brand is difficult. And then, of course, finally, the least easy to capture is impact. Does seeing this content make a difference in your life at the individual level or the level of society overall? Well, you can't capture that from social media data. You can't capture it from digital data, because the impact might be much longer term, and it might just be that a week after you see the story, you might remember in conversation, oh yeah, I saw that story, and now maybe I'll go out and protest, or I'll donate some money, or in some other way it changes how I act in the world. But that can't be captured, of course, by social media data. So these are really genuine, difficult questions that aren't easily answered, unfortunately. The industry continues to struggle with defining these measures and actually measuring more than just the real basics, the simplistic kind of things that can easily be captured. So again, and sorry, just a couple of larger quotes from this report. This is really the difficulty for the industry. So I'll just read this out because I think it is a really useful longer quote. Numbers need context. So just capturing these metrics isn't good enough. You need the context for them. And that's, says the deputy head of digital for the Times of London and the Sunday Times, Nick Petrie. Just having a number of how many people access a piece of content without the overall reference of how many people access the whole content section, for example, gives you little insight into how well your article did. If you just give journalists a number and say, 300 people have read it every day this week, well, the question is, is that good or bad? What does that even mean? Is that normal for all articles in this section, or is this 10 times more than any other article in that section has managed to get? And Jeremy Tarling from the BBC makes the same point. It's not just about providing people with dashboards. So it's not just about what we've just seen, which is all wonderful numbers and looks very impressive and colorful and everything, but it's the next step. So the dashboard's telling me that my average engage time was only 20 seconds on this article. What do I do with that? What does that mean? Should I improve that, or is 20 seconds good enough? Maybe they've they've managed to get all the important information that they needed within those 20 seconds, and that's all fine. So what do any of these numbers mean, and what do I do to perhaps improve them when we think that they're not good enough? And so again, the report says to make the move from these rudimentary, these very basic generic analytics to the kind of editorial analytics practiced by market leaders, here's what news media generally need to do: to define their editorial priorities and organizational goals. And that kind of means, well, what metrics, what data and metrics are most useful for pursuing these goals effectively? If you're saying we want to reach this particular segment of the audience, well, what metrics show us that we've reached that segment of the audience? If we want to position ourselves in such a way in the market, what metrics show us that we've made that change and we've positioned ourselves in that way? And that then ultimately means, of course, developing the tools, the organizational structures, and the newsroom cultures that make these analytics actionable, both short-term in the day-to-day coverage of events, and long-term in the organizational strategy and organizational positioning that is required to get to these longer-term goals. And frankly, this is still very much a space where there is a lot of uncertainty, and there continues to be a lot of experimentation with these different metrics as well. And what I want to do here for the moment is actually play you a video by the CEO of Chartbeat from 2016, Tony Hale, who provides some insights basically into how Chartbeat as a provider of these dashboard tools sees all of this emerging, or saw it all evolving, I guess, in 2016. Now, things will have moved on since then, but I think it's still quite a useful video to watch. And so I'm going to play this here and incorporate into this podcast. However, I'm clearly aware that the quality of playing this video and then recording it again and then putting it up in a webcast for you, the quality of the video may not be particularly good. So I've given you the link here as well, and that link is also in the slides, the PowerPoint slides I'm making available on the OLAT site. So one thing you might want to do also, if you're not quite getting the full range of what he's talking about from my recording of this video, is to actually go directly to that URL, watch it for yourselves, and kind of get a sense of really what he's talking about, maybe hear it a bit more clearly as well. But I'm going to switch for now to the video and play it, and then hopefully you will be able to see, get a bit more of a sense of what his thinking is basically about this. So it's about a 6-minute video. Let's get started, and I might just pause it from time to time to make a few comments as well. One thing I also need to warn you about is this is edited together from a longer speech, so there are a few kind of weird jumps in it. And frankly, he talks very, very fast. So you might want to just pause for yourselves every once in a while, maybe slow even the video down, or re-listen, re-watch, so that you really get what he's saying. And I can't do much about his delivery, but I think still the content is actually quite valuable and quite interesting. So let's go then.
One of the first things, the very first metric that people tend to talk about, because it's often so directly correlated with revenue, is page views. Page views equal revenue for us. We should be driving up people to be getting more and more page views.
So that's, again, that first point of page views. That's easy to measure, and it's kind of what Cherubini and Nielsen talk about as reach, I guess. It's easy to measure, and of course, if you are a commercial news organization, then page views really mean that people have seen your article, but also they've had a chance to encounter the ads that you've got on your page, and that's where your funding, your money comes from, your revenue comes from, as he says. So that's why page views are so important in many ways as well. Let's keep going.
And there's a kind of challenge with this when we start to use page views as a proxy for anything, because one of the things, if my clicker works, there we go, is that 55% of all page views get less than 15 seconds of attention. And we pulled out all the terms, all the top keywords around the most clicked on terms. And then we divided them into most clicked on and most read, and most clicked on and least read. And my God, it restores your faith in humanity.
So that again, that whole point about the time that people spend and the difference between clicked on and read is about not just page views, but engagement time as well. You might click on a story quickly and see, oh, well, that's just clickbait. That's not for me. I'm not actually interested. The headline sounded interesting, but I'm not interested. So I'm not going to spend any time on it. I'm going to move away again very quickly. And that would mean that, well, of course, again, you might not have had any time to see the ads, but also the content on that page, the content in that article probably hasn't actually reached you. So what he's distinguishing here is how much people are just clicking on and loading the page into their browser, and how much time they're actually spending reading these articles in any kind of detail. And he says that there are, as he says, some fairly positive and optimistic trends perhaps in this. So let's keep going.
Some of the things we had, so Obamacare, it was Snowden, it was Syria, were in the most reads per click. In the least reads per click, you had top, best, richest, fictional, colleges for some reason. And we found zero correlation between social sharing and engagement on the page. Zero share. Turns out people share for a bunch of different reasons, not just because they read every word of the article.
And that's another aspect as well. Of course, we can pick up on what's being read and what's being shared on social media as well. And sharing might be for all sorts of reasons, not just because people found a story interesting and they've really read through it. They might just find the headline interesting and they think, well, some of my followers will like this, so I'm going to share it, but I haven't actually read the article myself. Or they might just share it because they think, oh, well, if I share this article about Donald Trump or share this article about Joe Biden, that's really going to annoy the people on the other side of the political divide. So I'm just going to share it in order to kind of be a partisan political warrior, for instance. So again, the sharing of news on social media, which we can also easily pick up on via social media data, does not necessarily mean that people have really engaged with the story, have actually read the story itself. So again, there's a difference there between the different metrics that we might capture.
One of the things that Newsweek did was they published their top stories of 2015, based purely on kind of Facebook actions, Facebook likes, Facebook shares, and so forth. And when you look at that list, you get this. So the number one most important story of 2015 was on littlethings.com. 44 years ago, he wrote this song, but when he hears her sing it like this, he cries. This was the most important story of 2015, if you look at purely social shares. And there's a kind of running theme to a lot of the stories on this page, and that's that they're kind of clickbait bollocks. The trouble then becomes, though, if you're just using kind of social shares to try and drive your strategy, you can get into these kind of challenges where you end up publishing just this.
And that's, of course, a common criticism of social media data and social media engagement with the news, that it's led to more and more creation of clickbait, of stuff that seems attractive to users, not just to click on, in fact, but to share as well. And that ultimately undermines the quality of journalism, because more and more news organizations are just trying to create great metrics for themselves in terms of clicking and sharing, rather than necessarily quality content. And we'll get back to that later on in this particular lecture. But that term clickbait, of course, I'm sure you will have come across, and that's really what the data here on sharing shows very clearly as being successful in many ways, as well as generating lots of shares for stories with very little news content.
Now, there's been a few different news organizations that have been trying to look at this in a different way. The New York Times and New York Mag, for example, when they were looking at their kind of end of year and they wanted to try and sum up what they'd done, they decided to try and find a different way. They wanted to look at total time spent with their audience. And this is the kind of stories that you get. You get the Bataclan attacks as you come through. You've got the New York Times story about Amazon, which was a fabulous piece. You have Wired, and I've got permission from The Atlantic to kind of share some of this data with you guys. So this story, just to give you some guys, got 20 million page views. You've got 55 million minutes of engaged time. What that means is it's like getting more than 400,000 people in a room and getting them to watch the last Star Wars movie. That's how engaging this one article was.
And so this is, again, the importance of reading time as well. How much time do people spend with a story? Do they just click on this, see the headline, see the first paragraph, and then move on again? Or do they genuinely spend a long time reading through this in detail, taking all the detail in, taking all the information in? And so if you look at the reading time, as he says, some very, very different stories emerge that are really I guess, getting their information across that people are spending a lot of time with. So that's the importance of that particular metric, which I've pointed out a few times already in those dashboards as well.
And even though it was something of a unicorn in terms of its size and power, a lot of the things that came from this are actually indicative of what happens across the network in general. So one of the things that we see on this is that Facebook is utterly dominant when it comes to traffic, especially in those early days. You see kind of Google coming in there a little bit later, but not really driving as much. And we'll kind of get to Google in a bit. And then you have that little red line down there, that almost kind of flat line. And that's Twitter. And here is something that we see over and over again, which is that Facebook utterly dominates Twitter by an order of magnitude in terms of social traffic. And the interesting thing is that all the people in this room have probably spent far more time tweeting things from this conference than they have spent time on Facebook.
So that again is about, well, what role do these different platforms play? And while he's quite negative here about Twitter, I mean, the point, maybe the broader point to take away from this is that the long-term circulation of news content, certainly at that point, maybe other platforms have taken over some of this, happens on Facebook. That's where the larger communities are. That's simply where a larger number of news users are, and where things circulate through that everyday news sharing, that habitual gate watching that I've talked about in past weeks, for much longer and amongst networks of friends. Where Twitter is important, and actually his previous graph kind of showed that a little bit as well, is in the early breaking news phase. When something happens early on, then Twitter really is one of the best mechanisms for distributing that kind of content. But for the long term, the long tail, the long-term distribution of content across a much larger network of people and for a much longer period of time, Facebook absolutely beats it, because that's the slower circulation through everyone's networks, the sharing and on-sharing that takes place there. So I would read what he's presenting a little bit differently and not just say, well, forget about Twitter, but think about Twitter and Facebook serving very different purposes. The breaking news side of Twitter and the far and wide distribution that Facebook enables.
Our audience is on Facebook, we are on Twitter. That's something of a disconnect that we have to deal with. Speaking in kind of English, for every one article that Facebook drives traffic to, Google drives to about 16 articles. So what that means is during the kind of lulls, and this was kind of the time before the Bataclan attacks, which was that second big spike that you saw in that earlier slide, Google's kind of chugging along, delivering a good amount of traffic day by day. And Google gets the kind of an immediate spike as people start searching for this stuff, but then suddenly, boom, it's Facebook again, and just utterly dominant. Desktop and mobile are not zero-sum.
And just before we get into this part, so the role of Google is, as he says, sort of in between, basically. As there are perhaps no breaking news moments, there's nothing immediately happening. Google kind of serves the role of being a tool for discovering information. If you're searching for any topic that you might be interested in, you can find new news stories that way. So this is an important discovery mechanism for news, beyond the kind of breaking news stories or the stories that you know are already out there, and the sources perhaps of news that you know are already out there. You can find additional information and new information on new topics via Google. So that's another distinct role that particular platform plays compared to Twitter and Facebook. And now as he goes into the distinctions between the different ways in which we might be accessing the news via mobile, via desktop, via tablet, the point here of what he's saying about zero sum is that it's not just that you're either on one or on the other, that you're either on mobile or on desktop or on tablet, but that we all are using a combination of these different devices all of the time. We might have our mobile phone sitting next to our laptop computer, and we might be using both of those essentially to engage with the news and engage with the internet more broadly, obviously, as well. So let's keep going here.
This is a constant thing that I hear when I go and speak to media companies. They're like, well, desktop is clearly dying. That doesn't seem to be the case. So yes, it's absolutely true that mobile is already probably greater than 50%, moving towards 60, 70% of traffic. That's not because it's killing desktop, it's because it's outgrowing it. With Facebook, you're 3 to 4 times more likely to come from Facebook on mobile than, or from social in general, and social is largely Facebook, as we've seen, on mobile than you are on desktop. Like this kind of behavior even warps even further when you look at recirculation as well, because we also don't recirculate. Recirculation is when I've gone to a story, and then I choose to go on to another story.
So this is, again, these are the distinctions between the different platforms. If you're on a desktop device, if you're on a desktop browser, yes, you may actually go to the homepage of the news outlet because you think, well, what are they reporting about a particular story? So you might just enter CNN.com, or you might enter BBC.co.uk or SRF.ch or whatever. You might just go to whatever the front page is and then find the story there quite easily. And you might then also perhaps spend a bit more time with that website. On mobile, because in part on mobile devices, you will discover stories via your social media feeds on Twitter, on Facebook, and elsewhere. You might just go directly to that story that happens to be popping up in your social media feed. You might be discovering that that story exists and click on that link and go to that story, and then you've read that story and you move on back to your social media feed. You may not circulate on that website that you were directed to any further beyond reading that one story because you actually want to get back to your social media feed. So that's the distinctions that he's talking about between the way that we use these different platforms to access the news and then also what we do after we've accessed a particular news story.
Circulation is a huge challenge, and this is particularly a challenge because this, with time spent on a page, are the 2 key leading indicators of propensity to return. But there are some good signs as well for publishers on this. We don't recirculate, we don't go to homepages, but we do read. Averaging engaged time and scroll depth was about 3 minutes 40 for desktop, it's about 3 minutes for mobile, so pretty comparable and close. It is not true to say that the web is going towards worse and worse content. At least that's.
So that's, again, the length that people spend on particular pages. That's interesting because mobile has a bad reputation, essentially, for people just kind of snacking, just seeing the headlines and moving on. But from this, it clearly seems that, yes, people are perfectly happy to read a longer form piece on a mobile device as well. We have now become used to these small screens and to the formats that they enable. Of course, news publishers have also adjusted the way that they're formatting their stories so that they're more easily readable on mobile devices compared to just a few years ago. So more and more people are spending a lot of time on their mobile devices reading longer form stories as well. And that's encouraging in a sense if you're thinking about, well, the way that people, or the extent to which people are informing themselves.
That's not what the data says when you look at it right. On a note of caution, as media companies, we have to be aware of the incredible dominance of Facebook, particularly on mobile. Media companies do 5 things. They create content, they host content, they curate content, they distribute content, and they monetize content. On mobile, Facebook now dominates curate and distribute. With instant articles, they're now taking on hosting and monetization, which leaves create.
So that's actually important, and we'll get back to that later on in this semester as well. The fact that more and more of the news process overall happens on social media platforms, and happens in this case on Facebook particularly, that really now the news organizations themselves are simply creating content, but that content might then, yes, still be hosted on their website, but also might be posted directly as what in Facebook's case was called instant stories, directly on Facebook. So people might never actually leave Facebook anymore as a platform in order to read the story. They might actually see everything that they want to see directly on Facebook as a platform. And that gives Facebook, of course, more and more power over the whole process, more and more of a component of the revenue, the advertising money that otherwise would have gone to news outlets. And that is a real challenge because the news outlets, of course, still need to finance somehow how they operate. And the more things happen on Facebook, where Facebook gets all the money, the less money goes back to the news organization. So from a purely business and operational point of view, this is a very, very distinct challenge. And again, we'll talk more about this in a later week as well.
Now, this may mean that media companies in the future can focus purely on what they're truly best at, the creation of incredible content. It's going to open up wide new vistas. Or it could mean their utter disintermediation. I have no idea.
All right, and we'll leave it there on that slightly inconclusive note. And this is, of course, yes, this is one of the big challenges now for social media, so for news organizations as they engage with social media. All right, so I'm hoping this was useful as a kind of intervention from really an expert in the field, obviously from a professional point of view, the CEO again of Chartbeat, of one of the big providers of these news metrics dashboards for news companies. So let's go on a little bit further to this kind of question of, well, what happens if we quantify journalism, if we metrify journalism, if we capture all of these metrics about how well individual stories do, individual journalists do, and then also, of course, news organizations themselves do. What's emerging from all of this, and again, this is from the report by Cherubini and Nielsen, is to say, well, okay, there is a more and more of this kind of systematic analysis of the quantitative data on ultimately what is audience behavior, of course, audience engagement with the news that we see, and that's now incredibly common, of course. But as they say, and I think as even Tony Hale would admit as well, a lot of the metrics still aren't particularly advanced and sophisticated. They are saying, and this is from 2016, basically contemporary forms of analytics are very good at understanding the main ways in which people use digital media in 2010, which is a while ago by now. So we need better metrics, we need more up-to-date metrics, we need metrics that move with the times, move with the platforms as well, and capture what people are doing with the news today, rather than just what they did back then. And that, for instance, also means not just now looking at Facebook and still Twitter and other platforms, but also starting to look at some of the other platforms that have come along in the meantime, Instagram, WhatsApp, TikTok, and so on. How do we capture the metrics from those platforms as well, when perhaps that's not as easy as it has been for Facebook or Twitter in the past? And again, what do newsrooms actually do with this? I like this quote from a piece by Edson Tandock, where he's interviewed this newsroom manager saying, it's like crack, it's like, it's psychedelic, it's exciting. You can sit here and watch it popping all night. You can see the numbers move up and down. You can see all this stuff sort of going on. You just may have no idea what it means. But it looks like it's important, and it looks like we're doing well, or maybe it looks sometimes like we're not doing well, and then it pops up again. So it's kind of addictive in some ways, is really what he's saying. You can follow it, and you can try and, get better at getting good metrics for your pieces, for your stories. You can maybe find the tricks that make a story or make your content overall generate better metrics. But the question really is, well, does that give us better journalism, or does it just result in clickbait and end up with chasing particular metrics that we think are important without really knowing why they're important? And of course, once you start focusing on particular metrics, well, as Jonah Peretti here says, the natural inclination, if one metric is seen as the important true metric, is to game it, to try and find ways to artificially boost that metric and generate more value, essentially, or drive up the numbers, basically. So, for instance, what we've seen at times when the number of clicks on news articles and maybe the recirculation rate was seen as important was that, for instance, a news outlet might just split the one news story into 3 different pages. So rather than just getting the one-page view, you now get 3-page views if people click from the first part to the second part to the third part. And you get a better recirculation rate because it means that they're going from one page to another to another. Now, the story is still the same. The length of the story is still the same. The quality of the story may not have changed, but it's gaming these metrics. It's artificially turning 1 into 3 by just formatting it slightly differently and making people click on these links more. And of course, people didn't necessarily click on those links, so that was probably a failed attempt to really boost these metrics, to game these metrics. And by the way, Jonah Peretti, who I'm citing here, isn't just anyone. He is the creator of BuzzFeed. And if anyone knows about generating metrics, creating clickbait, and getting audience engagement, then it is the creator of BuzzFeed, of course. So we should take this with a great deal of a sense that he knows what he's talking about. And he says, well, of course, yes, BuzzFeed itself has been built around the idea that the distribution of journalism will happen primarily through social networks. So in some ways, it too was built to game the metrics, to game journalism, to create a form of journalism that is suited directly to distribution on social networks. And really, if we come back to this idea of gatewatching and gatekeeping, of selecting what gets published, and of audiences kind of seeing what gets published and then selecting from that what they want to pass on to their own followers, what we're now seeing as a feedback loop between this. The newsrooms still make a choice of what stories they publish. The audiences then watch that, see the stories coming through the gates, select some of those and give them extra attention by retweeting, by on-sharing, by engaging, and so on, by clicking on them, of course, and reading them as well. And the newsrooms now pick up on the data, on that gate watching, and that might in turn influence their further decision-making processes within the newsroom. So rather than the newsroom just doing what it does based on some journalistic principles or whatever, now the newsroom makes more and more of these gatekeeping decisions based on how it sees the audience gate-watching the stories it publishes. So that's the feedback loop that is now starting to happen here. And of course, there's plenty of experimentation with this sort of stuff as well. In some ways, this is really, you could summarize this as a form of social media optimization. People are trying to make social media content as widely shareable as possible, and they're optimizing essentially how this works. This is in some ways a new version of search engine optimization as well, which is basically trying to optimize, of course, the visibility of stories in search as they come up. But it's, of course, translating that to social media. And beyond that, not just that they're trying to optimize this by guessing what might work well, but more and more now they're also doing A/B testing of different aspects of the pieces that they're publishing. They might try the same post, the same story with different headlines, with different selections of images and videos, with different descriptions in the social media versions as well, the social media headers that you see as the story is being shared, and so on. They might also, on their own websites, change the way that stories are placed and arranged, positioned on the front page of the news outlet, or promoted on the news site. And to some extent also, they're now presenting all of those metrics of engagement directly to audiences, because that in itself might also draw audiences to that content. If they can say to audiences, this is currently our most read story on this page, on this site, then that might mean that, oh yeah, as an audience member, I'll say, yeah, I want to read that as well. That must be important then. So that's the sort of optimization that's going on. And I want to show you here a few examples of this from a blog post that tried to test this for the New York Times and kind of observed how the New York Times is doing that. So here's the evolution of a New York Times headline over time, obviously also as new information comes to hand, but also as they're trying to tweak really what type of headline might work best and might attract the biggest audience. So it went from SpaceX to test launch another prototype of rocket to Mars, to SpaceX halts test launch of prototype for rocket to Mars, to SpaceX to retry the test launch of the prototype for a rocket to Mars, to SpaceX launches, lands, and explodes prototype of its rocket to Mars, which is somewhat confusing. Why would they do that? So then they said SpaceX Mars rocket prototype explodes, but this time it landed first. Then they just changed a little bit of the grammar. SpaceX Mars rocket prototype explodes, but this time it lands first. And then finally, SpaceX Mars rocket prototype explodes, but it lands first. So that's how often this story has changed its headline. And of course, that might also then attract a very different sense of audience or whatever from it. So this is all the sort of stuff that's basically happening here. Now, in this case, it might just be as new information comes to hand, but this happens all the time also as they're experimenting with more or less attractive headlines. So here's an example of the same story with very different headlines. Speak softly and carry a big agenda. I have no idea what that's about by just looking at the headline, to Biden is the anti-Trump and it's working. And clearly, after a bit of experimentation early on, that's what they went with, and that got 93% of the visibility. So that's the kind of experimentation with headlines that's going on here. Just another example about the former New York governor, Cuomo, attacked over his plan for review of sex harassment claims. Then it got a bit more dramatic. Under siege, Cuomo revises plan to review sex harassment claims. And then finally, under siege over sex harassment claims, Cuomo offers apology. So again, different features of the story being highlighted here, and probably producing a very, very different impact ultimately also in terms of its visibility on social media and in the engagement it received as well. Because, of course, this was done from the outside, so we don't know exactly what metrics these stories received, but I think we can see from the evolution and from what the New York Times eventually settled on, that these final headlines must be the ones that they felt were most effective, most shareable, produced the most engagement, and so on. And then finally, from a different site, news.com.au, which is sort of a middle-of-the-road Australian news site, I wanted to just show you that last bit about presenting metrics directly to audiences and what that looks like. And it looks like this. So basically on a page here, it says you may also like the most read stories, the trending topics, and the story that got the most comments, with a handy video attached to it as well. So that's what many news sites now do quite regularly as a way to say to audiences, hey, you know, maybe you want to be like everyone else. You want to see what everyone else has been reading, or you want to get all the stuff that is trending right now, whatever trending actually means in this context, or you want to have a say on the story that's already got the most comments as well. So that's really, again, quite common now on many news sites, whether they're more tabloid and middle of the road like news.com.au or more quality outlets as well. So what does that mean in a sense? Is this kind of just following what's popular, or does it actually produce more populist type of news content, clickbait ultimately, or stuff that just is enraging or exciting or in some forms generates engagement? That's the big question here then. And this is, again, an open kind of debate, of course. So we might see that the most read and the best rated articles or the most watched videos gain prominence are then also implicitly considered as the most important or the most relevant, but really ultimately they're just more popular. So they might not be the best stories. And this is, again, the sort of distinction that we've seen, I think, with the metrics that Tony Hale talked about, the differences between the ones that are most shared and the ones that people actually spend time reading. There obviously was a vast difference. So maybe all that this produces is insight on what's most popular, and then therefore produces more content like that. And of course, as Wiebke Loosen and Jan Schmidt are saying, you know, we don't just perhaps want journalism that gives the people what they want, that gives them perhaps what they engage with the most or what they share the most or click on the most. Otherwise, we'll just get more and more and more clickbait and hardly any stories that deal with more complex and more problematic topics. So journalism needs to still do something else, something other than just giving people what they want, producing all of these populist possibly stories. But at the same time, as again a journalist quoted by Edson Tandock says, I don't think we have the luxury of thinking that way anymore, because if the company is not making money, then I might get laid off. I mean, that's just the way it is. So at the same time, journalism can't just produce difficult and complex investigative pieces that maybe a small number of people really read in detail, because that's not generating enough money. You need the clickbait, in a sense, to finance the proper journalism or the more in-depth journalism that takes more money to produce. And in some ways, of course, that is the business model that BuzzFeed has attempted to follow as well, being very much a clickbait site with listicles and everything else, but using some of that funding to try and finance more in-depth political journalism as well. And that may well be one of the emerging business models for the journalism industry as well. But of course, all of this, again, remains in flux as well. And again, as Carabin and Nielsen, they are saying analytics and data metrics will continue to evolve. And journalists actually need to be part of that process, need to be very deeply involved in all of this. Because if they're not, the tools and the techniques that are developed will continue to reflect and empower only the commercial and technological priorities and not the editorial priorities of the news outlet. So that's really the big challenge there, having the journalist involved in developing these metrics and making sure that it's not just the commercial interests of creating clickbait that dominate here. And, you know, as far as at least Jonah Peretti from BuzzFeed is concerned, who, again, knows a lot about metrics, he says, well, we look at lots of metrics, but ultimately it's still the creative ideas that journalists have for how to cover particular stories and what stories to cover. That is the raw material of journalism, and that remains important. So he seems to be reasonably, I guess, optimistic about where this is going. We may have more reason to be skeptical by now. This quote is from some years ago because of everything that's happened in the meantime, however. And so really what we're starting to talk about is the nexus between platforms, their algorithms, which generate those metrics, between the money that ultimately you get for having lots of people click on your stories and engage with them, and of course the audiences whose metrics ultimately, whose behavior ultimately we are trying to measure in all of this. And if nothing else, all of this gives the platforms, of course, immense power. The platforms are where all of this happens. Twitter and Facebook and TikTok and WhatsApp and all of the other platforms, that's where all of this is happening. And so they are the connecting tissue that ties all of this together. And of course, that gives them great opportunities as well to position themselves as sort of as important. As Ali Nabil Ahmad here says, journalists are a pretty useful source of marketing for Twitter and have been for some time. Twitter can say, here, news breaks on Twitter. Journalists are on Twitter. All the important journalists are on Twitter. So you should be as well, dear user. And that's how Twitter has in part marketed itself for some time. But of course, that also means that, well, all the advertising money ends up going to the tech companies that provide these platforms and not to the news outlets that provide the content. And so again, Ahmad is saying this is really transforming newspaper websites into appendages of Americanized corporate information capitalism. Now, that may be a particularly strong way of putting it, but essentially, yes, newspaper websites, news sites overall are now just providing the input into what circulates on social media from that perspective, and are themselves dependent on social media for exposure. So they're increasingly the junior partner to these corporate behemoths like Facebook, or now Meta as the owner of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, that are dominating the global market for advertising, for information dissemination, for social media engagement. And this is in some ways a deal with the devil, although Emily Bell puts it slightly more delicately by saying it's a trade-off between control of your own journalism versus reaching large audiences. If you just run your own website and you put all your content there, or your own app and you put all your content there, you've got full control over what goes on there. But it might just not reach any audiences because the audiences are on Facebook and the other platforms. So you've got to weigh up, what do you want? Do you want to be in full control, or would you rather actually reach an audience and thereby have to give over control to these other companies, these other platform providers? And so, well, Facebook and other platforms still say, well, we're definitely not a media company. No, not at all. We're just a carriage service. We're just a place where people gather and do whatever they want, whether it's news or something else. Definitely not a media company. Don't get us wrong. But, and this is kind of a slightly new tone, we do recognize that we play an important role, and that means we have responsibilities. Ideally not many, and ideally ones that we can avoid, but we do have responsibilities. And, you know, the challenge here is really, well, what does all of this mean? Facebook in some ways, of course, also depends to some extent at least, on new content being created that is then shared via its platform. That's what keeps people coming back there, that new stuff is happening. So maybe there's a need then also to direct some more of the money that Facebook earns by providing the platform for news and other content to circulate back to the people who are actually producing that content, including news organizations. That's being attempted in some places. We've had an attempt in Australia that didn't go particularly well, to be perfectly honest, but it is being attempted. And that's also why we see these kinds of images more often and have seen them more often in recent years, because policymakers, lawmakers, parliaments, Congress in the US are increasingly recognizing the power of these platforms, both commercial power as well as power over public expression, as well as power over the circulation of information. And so more and more people like Mark Zuckerberg here are being called to testify in front of Congress, are being called to testify in front of the European Parliament and other parliaments, to justify the way that they operate and justify why they should not be regulated any more than they currently are. And increasingly, we are seeing attempts to regulate them, both in Europe, in the EU, as well as in the US. But there's still quite a long way to go. And even, as and when that happens, the question ultimately for news is, well, does that provide them with more funding? Where does the funding for news actually come from in the longer term? And in some ways, some people say, well, news companies have made a lot of mistakes ultimately when the internet first came along, when the web first came along, as they kind of moved to this new medium. And they still haven't answered that question. So Juadel is saying the industry's decade-long search for a working business model for the web edition itself has not been successful. They've simply not got an actual business model for how to make this pay for itself. And the fundamental problem has been with this, well, when the web first came along, they simply put all of their content online for free, partly because there weren't really any payment models, any ways to generate revenue from this online version. And people thought, well, the web's not really that important in the early days, so let's just put our stuff on there and it just advertises what we do. So Thomas Hanich is saying providing online news for free was one of the most far-reaching collective failures of the media industries by putting their content online for free. And of course, it still is. I mean, you can go to many websites, news websites, and see the content perfectly for free without having to pay, without having to register or anything else. So that's still in place. And doing this means that it is now very difficult to move away from that model and say, oh no, now, sorry, dear user, but now you have to pay for this content. Some websites, of course, have tried to do this by creating paywalls and so on. If you go to the New York Times, if you go to the Washington Post, if you go to some other news outlets, you are now asked to subscribe and to pay before you can access their content. But of course, that may work to some extent for these major news outlets that people might genuinely be interested in. I might be interested in seeing what does the New York Times think about this particular topic. But for ordinary news publishers, that's probably not going to work, because if I can't see how my local newspaper is covering a particular political issue, well, I can always go to the free website of the public broadcast organization or some other competitor outlet and see the same content there or very similar content there. So unless the content that a news publisher offers is very, very distinct, I can find equivalent coverage for free somewhere else. So why would I want to pay for content if I can see so much of it for free elsewhere? And of course, the other option was to keep it all free, but to run ads on these sites and generate a bit of revenue from users viewing those ads. That's been undermined by the increasing use of ad blockers as plugins in browsers. And of course, even the pre-installation of ad blockers as you are now installing, Google Chrome or Firefox or other browsers on your computer, you might even get the ad blocker immediately with that to begin with. So the more these sorts of technologies have become available, of course, the fewer users actually end up seeing ads in the first place. And so that revenue has dried up again as well. And the news organizations aren't getting money from ads in this way. And so, again, the question is, well, with the move from the web to social media, have they made the same mistake, essentially? By putting their content, by putting their news on social media, or at least some summary of their news, or just the headline on social media for free, because, you can't subscribe and pay to follow a news organization on Twitter or Facebook. So by putting all of this, again, for free on social media, and by granting audience access to aggregators, well, our newspapers repeating the same mistake again, as they're making this content available. So are they again limiting their opportunity to actually find some for-pay models, some business models that require users to pay and generate the revenue, in much the same way that they did when the web first came along. However, notably, in some countries, particularly in smaller countries with their own distinct languages, so not so much in the English, in the global English Anglosphere, but in some smaller countries, people are more likely to want to pay for the news, to offer to pay for the news. So paywalls and other mechanisms by which people are paying for the news online work better in those countries. And that may be because the markets are smaller, because perhaps people are realizing that their news industry is under threat, because perhaps they do want their own domestic in-language news rather than just the BBC or the CNN coverage of what's going on in their country. So in some smaller countries, there is a greater willingness to pay for the news. Whether that's enough to provide the funding that news actually needs, that the news industry actually needs, that's a different question, and that's still very much an open question as well. So the other thing, of course, that news outlets have also been doing in dealing with all of this is to change the content of their news in a way, and the formatting of their news in a way that makes it more accessible and more successful, perhaps, in social media. Even with all the issues that I've just raised, they are still, of course, trying to optimize their content for social media. And so that might mean focusing more on the individual story than on the website itself as the place where that story lives. It's the story, it's the URL, the link to the individual story that gets circulated on social media. And again, without recirculation, people might never actually go to the front page of the New York Times or any other kind of news outlet. They might just see its individual stories. So that's maybe where you need to focus if you're a news organization that wants its content to be seen. It might also optimize its content more for news snacking. And that means really, again, which we've seen to some extent in what Tony Hale said as well, people might not spend a huge deal of time necessarily with all the news stories that they read. They might just want to get the core information very quickly, and that's news snacking, and that's a very short and possibly quite shallow news consumption session. You might just do that as you're waiting to meet someone, as you're in your daily commute on the tram. In whatever situation, you might just flip up your mobile phone and read a few news headlines and feel a bit better informed. So optimizing your content for that is also important if you want to be seen by a large number of audiences. Again, particularly for mobile, particularly perhaps as people are in transit, as they're on the go, as they're just taking a quick break somewhere, just the mobile comes out and you read a few news stories and then you move on again. You might also optimize your content to be more easily amplified by news influencers, by influencers overall, by these journalists who have their own personal brands as well. So it might also be more optimized for that. It might actually directly engage with some of these people as well to say, hey, here's a new story on something that your followers might find interesting, and hope that person will reshare that story to their hundreds of thousands or millions of followers. And so in some ways, the question then becomes, is this still embedding social media into journalistic practice? Is it normalizing the use of social media in journalistic practice? Or is it actually the other way around? Is it embedding news into social media environments? Is it normalizing journalism into the logics of social media? And that's a question of power ultimately. Is it still journalism deciding how they want to use social media in their daily practices? Or is it in fact journalists and journalism organizations, news organizations now saying, well, we give up and all we can do is to try and make ourselves as visible as possible within these social media environments, but we very much know we're the underdog here. We are living by the rules of social media. We're no longer living by our own rules, which is a very significant shift for what has been a very proud profession, and a profession that has very much tried to police its own boundaries and remain independent of the trends of the day. So, as Molyneux says here, it seems that now that journalists have this direct line to their audience via social media, they've actually changed the way that they operate. They've begun to act differently than they would have done in other news arenas. Their focus, yes, is still on the news. They're still journalists, but they're taking on very different roles of commentator, of heckler, of interpreter, of marketer, of personal news brand again, ultimately, and so on. And that also, in addition to the power of the platforms, points us to the power of audiences, of course, to direct, in a sense, how journalism might now work. Again, and I've used this quote before, in the space of social media, journalism and audiences meet on uncommon ground. Neither of them are in control. They're both there at the whim of the platforms themselves. They're both on a platform that's operated by an independent third party, by Twitter, by Facebook, by WhatsApp, by whoever. So neither of them are in control, but that's the space where they're meeting. And Twitter, and really all the other platforms as well, become distribution channels for news that are not controlled by the news media, by news organizations anymore. Journalists, yes, they might tweet the links to their news articles. They're still in control of what they themselves can say, but it's the distributed response of the Twitter community and of all the other social media communities that ultimately determines whether that news spreads and how far it spreads and to whom. So audiences have a lot more to do now with making news stories visible than they did before. And as Manuel Castells says here, while this old struggle for social domination, counter-domination, for instance, between news makers and audiences continues in the new media space, the structural bias of this space towards the powers that be, so towards the old establishment powers of the news industry, of politics, of the media industry more broadly, is being diminished every day by the new social practices of communication, by audiences and by the platform providers themselves. So just because something is on a news website anymore doesn't mean it gets seen. It gets seen because that story then is redistributed across social media by audiences, by users. That now determines much more of how visible a story will be. And so, the fundamental point, I guess, that I'm trying to make is this. Journalists enter these new media spaces, these social media spaces, but they don't control them. They operate according to principles that challenge professional boundaries of what is a journalist and what isn't, on a number of different levels. And that means, ultimately, that journalistic outlets, the news companies themselves, might have to adapt to the rules of that collaboration, of that very open, collaborative, mixed, diverse, hybrid space in which they now operate. They cannot simply operate by their own rules anymore. And this includes a self-image, as Ansgar Heinrich here says, of being just one node amongst many others. No longer necessarily the leading medium that determines what is news and what isn't. The New York Times still says all the news that's fit to print, which basically means we decide what's news and what isn't. And that just no longer works in this kind of space. In this kind of space, well, it's the audiences that decide from all of the coverage that you have available, which of these stories do we think are important? Which of these are we going to make trend? Which of these are we going to discuss and share and engage with more than others, perhaps. So that's the power of audiences mixed with the power of platforms that reduces ultimately the power of the news industry itself, of journalists as well. And that's where we leave it for today. So next time, we are going to look at a particular journalistic format, a novel journalistic format that really is trying to resolve some of these differences, some of these conflicts between platforms and audiences and news creators, journalists themselves, and that's live blogs. In preparation for this, please read chapter 7 of the book, which goes into some detail about this as well.